Well, 'tis the season. You hear that all over lately. It is the season. I want to read you just a poem really quickly. Time of the Mad Atom. Atom. A-T-O-M. This is the age of the half-read page and the quick hash and the mad dash. The bright night with the nerves tight. The plane hop with a brief stop. The lamp tan in short span. The big shot in a good spot. And the brain strain, the heart pain, and the cat naps till the spring snaps and the fun is done. That's kind of the society we live in. That's kind of how people look at life. That's how people are living their life. And we don't even realize it, but sometimes we can get caught up in that. Do you know that each one of us has one coin in life, and that coin is the time that we're given in life? And we choose how we're going to spend that coin. We choose if we're going to let someone else spend that coin for us, or what we're going to spend that coin on. It's all our choice. And I mention that just to mention time, because time and season sometimes are interchangeable. We talk about it being springtime, or it's the spring season. We talk about it being summertime, or it's the summer season, and so on. Wintertime, winter season. And so season often is used to talk about a time, a specific time, or a time. And the Bible does the same thing. The Bible talks about different seasons. It says in Psalm 104 and verse 19 that the moon determines, or is set there to determine the seasons. And the sun knows its time to set. And so time and season are really interchangeable. And so because it's the season, I thought this morning would be a good thing for us to do, to look at the Bible and look at what the Bible says about seasons. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14, we read about God creating the world, designing the universe. And in that, it says, and he created the seasons. And he set the moon there to determine between the seasons. And so we understand that God's created the seasons we have. Summer, fall, winter. And he created it all with a purpose. In Psalm 104, which I've already mentioned, it talks about God doing that. The psalmist says that's what God has done. And we understand that and we recognize that. And it's interesting because in Daniel had an interesting life. He's taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. He stood up for God against all odds. I mean, you and I probably would have cowered long before he started. And he stood up against a kingdom, a world-ruling power. He stood up against them. And he stood for God. And in chapter 2, Daniel's answering, he's praising God because of the vision he said that he's had. And in verse 21 he says, God, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things, and he knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. And he goes on and he says all these things, but we get the idea that everybody through history understood that God created our seasons. That he was the one in charge of the seasons. And Solomon, in all his wisdom that God gave him, I mean, he asked for wisdom and God gave him wisdom. And he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 to 8, that there is a time for everything, or a season for everything. He says the fruit has its season. And I know I grew up in BC, and it's very true. You can tell almost to the day when the fruit will be ready on the trees to eat. The cherry season starts early, around the end of June, the last week in June. Sometimes it's a little bit earlier than that. Apple season starts in August. And so you have all these seasons for the fruit. Or you have the seasons for the grain. If you grew up on the prairies, you would know that because you probably lived on a farm or know someone that lived on a farm. And the grain has its different seasons. And then depending on where you live in the world, you can have the rainy season and the dry season. And so on. And so Solomon says, you need to understand there is a season for everything. And so we're talking about these kinds of seasons. And today you and I still experience that. I don't particularly like the winter season, but we have a winter season. We have a summer season, we have a spring season, we have a fall season. And there are things that we like to do in every one of those seasons that we enjoy doing. And we get to do. There's other seasons as well that we have. But God designed these seasons for us to have. And if you look at science and what they've discovered, you will find that the cold winters we have up here are really good for us because it keeps the flu bugs down for one, but it also makes the trees hardy. You go in a place where the season doesn't have that extreme winter, and the trees aren't nearly as hardy as the trees are up here. So there's good things about the seasons. All that being true, there's another way that we use this idea of seasons. And I want us to look at that. The Jews, as you read through history in the Bible, you will see that they had different seasons. Passover was in a certain season, and they celebrated that Passover every season the same. And they actually called it sometimes the season of the Passover. And so that was probably in the spring, but they called that a season. Hanukkah was a season. It's done at a certain time, and that certain time every year, and it became a season. And I want to show you that because in Esther chapter 9, it's interesting, the story of Esther. I don't know if you've ever read that story, but Esther is taken captive with all of her fellow Israelites, and her uncle Mordecai plays an important part in this. But Esther's there, and the king that captured them is having trouble with his queen. And so they work things out where Esther gets to go before the king, and she gets chosen as his queen. Well, what's happened is there's a fellow by the name of Haman, and he's an evil, wicked man, and he has 10 sons. And so he goes and he gets a decree. He tricks the king into giving a decree for them to exterminate the Jews. Literally a Holocaust. To take them out. To annihilate the Jews. And so Esther and Mordecai and the Jews, of course, they're all terrified. And they're praying to God that God would intervene in everything. And through them, God does intervene. And eventually what happens is Esther becomes queen. And Esther gets the ear of the king. And she tells the king about the wickedness of Haman. And how the Jews weren't opposing the king. They were willing to live in exile in his kingdom at peace with him. And they weren't causing trouble. And so the whole thing turns around, and Haman and his 10 sons are hung, and the Jews are allowed, if you can imagine, to go through the kingdom that they are captive in and annihilate all their haters. Now that's the story of Esther, kind of. But in that, Esther and Mordecai write a decree that the Jews are supposed to honor the season of the Purim. And you probably ask what a Purim is, and I did the same thing. I asked, what? What does that mean? So you have to go and you have to research it out and find what it was. Well, what it was, Purim in Hebrew means the annihilated, or those broken to pieces and are no more. And so the season of Purim was that the Jews were going to be annihilated, totally destroyed. But they celebrated it because they were delivered from that season. But it's called a season, and they had to remember the season of the Purim. And so the Jews called times in their history seasons. We do the same thing today. We have Christmas. Jesus didn't establish Christmas. Christmas was established as a holiday by some people. But we have Christmas, and we celebrate the Christmas season. Or we have Easter, and we celebrate the Easter season. Or Thanksgiving is the end or the wrap-up of the harvest season. And so we have created a bunch of seasons as well. And I'm not saying that it's good, bad, or otherwise. It's just what we have. God gave us the seasons, and we've added some seasons to it, or taken it and broken it down into more seasons. And so we have all kinds of seasons. The one that I really like is hunting season. Diane doesn't like it so much, but we have a season. We call it hunting season. I get to go hunting. But we have all of these seasons. What we have to remember is that we have to keep those seasons in perspective. And sometimes that's the challenge. You know, we can get so busy in our seasons that we forget about God. And that is not a good thing. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul is writing to the church at Galatia, and he gives them kind of a stern rebuke. He says, formerly, chapter 4, starting in verse 8, he says, formerly when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God. How can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. Now, what was going on there in Galatia? Well, in the church, they had started to elevate the importance of their seasons and of their days and their months and their holding all these special things. They had started to elevate that over Christ. They were more important than Christ was, to the point that those things dictated their life instead of Christ dictating their life. And Paul says, I'm beside myself. Have I labored in vain? Have I done all of these things with you and encouraged you in Christ and brought you to Christ just for you to go back and worship all these seasons and all these things and have them dictate what you do in your life? He said, I hope not. I hope that's not the case. And you and I have to be aware that it doesn't happen to us. We can get so caught up, and I have seen people get so caught up in Christmas or in Thanksgiving or in whatever season it is. They get so caught up that they forget all about God. They forget all about what Jesus did for them. And they say Jesus is Lord, and they're off and they're chasing everything but Jesus. And we have to be careful. That's one of our challenges. You know, when we're doing something we like to do, it can sometimes get to the point that it interferes with God in our life. And we want to stop it before it gets there. And so that's what Paul's saying to the Galatians. He's saying, don't let all of these seasons and all of these things get in your way. And I'm saying, don't even let the Christmas season get in your way of Christ. Because I'm telling you, the world out there, they have a different view of it than we have. And we all know that that's not his birth date anyways. But I'm just saying, take the opportunity to share Christ, but don't let Christmas override Christ. And then Paul said, but there's one more season I want to tell you about. There's another season that is far more important than all these other seasons. And the Galatian church had missed that. It's interesting. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 7, Jesus is telling the apostles that the kingdom's coming. It's going to be there right away. And they have a human nature just like you and I have a human nature. And they were curious just as you and I are curious. And so they're standing there and Jesus said, the kingdom's coming. And they said, when? Tell us when. And he says, the season is not for you to know. The time is not for you to know. God knows. You need to be prepared. That's all. Just be ready for it. It's not for you to know the season. And of course, what I believe he's talking about in Acts chapter 1, the season was in Acts chapter 2. The coming of the kingdom. The church is established. It began, and what a glorious beginning. And that was a season. A glorious season. And in that season, there was a lot of work. There was a lot of work to do in the church season. They got busy preaching the gospel, sharing the gospel with people, teaching people, admonishing people with the gospel, encouraging people, building people up. And the church was growing, and they were celebrating the season of Christ. And Paul said that is the important season. And it was a full-time work. And they warned people, be prepared always. Because we don't know when this season's going to end. And you want to be ready. And so they talked about this season of the church, of Christ. It was something that was worth being prepared for. And then Paul said in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2 to Timothy, he said, be prepared in season and out of season. Be always prepared. It doesn't matter what season it is physically. The important season is the season of Christ. It's Christ that is important. And you want to keep that focus. So it doesn't matter what season it is here, you need to be doing the Lord's work. You need to be prepared always for that. And then we read about the season coming to a close. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13. Paul has just, in chapter 4, has just talked to them about living a life that is pleasing to God. Aspiring to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, to work with your own hands, to just look after, make sure you're living a right life. So that you may walk properly before outsiders and dependent on no one except Christ. And he's teaching them all of these things. And then he says, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. He's talking about the end of this season. He said that he's going to come like a thief in the night. You don't know the hour. Just be prepared. It's kind of like Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 of them took oil with them and were prepared. 5 forgot to bring oil or didn't bring oil for whatever reason. And they wanted to borrow oil, and the 5 that had the oil said, no, because if we lend it to you, our oil might run out too while we're waiting for the bride. And so they went back to town to get some oil, the other 5, and they missed the coming of the bride. And Jesus said at the end of that parable, he said, so always be prepared. And that was his point. So we need to be prepared in this season. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, Paul says, and let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. You see, we need to understand that we serve a Lord that is living, that is never dead. And Paul says, if you don't give up, the rewards will be there. They're going to be there. That's a guarantee. There is nothing that's not going to let that happen. And so this glorious season is going to come to an end, but it's going to come to an eternal end. It's going to move on to eternity. And that's the season that you want to be in. That's what Paul says. That's the season you need to be prepared for, that you're working for, and that you're going to get the reward. It is the season. It's Christmas time. It's a time of excitement for the world. It's a time of family, of fancy food, good food, of parties, of giving of gifts. And it's just more stores survive only because of Christmas season than anything else through the rest of the year. That's how the world celebrates Christmas. But that isn't our focus. But it is easy to get caught up in and get distracted. And that's what we need to be aware of. We do not want to claim to be a Christian in vain. We want to be a Christian and live as a Christian. And don't let things in this world take our focus off of Christ as they were doing in the Galatian church. The world says that 'tis the season. God says this 'tis the season. Christ. Salvation in Christ. The only important one to know. Eternally valuable. Everything else, every other season will pass away, but not Christ. Every other season is fleeting, but not Christ. And so keep the faith. Keep the focus. Don't get distracted by the seasons of the world. Persevere to the end and gain your reward. If you're here this morning and you're struggling with that, or you're struggling with anything, we would like to help you. If you haven't started that journey to that season, we want to help you. We're here to help you. We want to encourage you. So we ask you to come while we stand and sing.
It's so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take Him at His word, just to rest upon His promise, just to know thus saith the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I proved Him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. Oh, how just in simple faith to plunge me 'neath the healing, cleansing flood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I prove Him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. Yes, 'tis sweet to trust in Jesus, just from sin and self to cease, just from Jesus simply taking life and rest and joy and peace. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I prove Him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. I'm so glad I learned to trust Thee, precious Jesus, Savior, friend, and I know that Thou art with me, will be with me till the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I proved Him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus.